So, welcome back. Welcome back to me. It's a different day. So let's finish up this lecture. So this will be part two of lecture two on the specific factor model. We'll pick up right where we left off. So if you have questions about the uh, fundamentals of this model, or well, let's just say it, I recommend you go back and take a look at the first video on this model if you haven't seen it already. Otherwise, it's not going to make a lot of sense. Okay, so the slide over here, cat, it picks off where we left off. So we were on the previous slide, just to remind you quickly, this one here, where we were illustrating the gains from trade in the specific factor model. Just very quickly to reiterate where we were. We started off with point A. Point A represented a point on the production possibilities frontier, a relatively even mix of agricultural and manufacturing goods. And when trade opened, we moved to the set of prices revealed by PM over PA superscript W, which produced a production point of B, tangent C, and then a consumption point of C. Again, the tangent C, except for this time, the tangent C to the indifference curve as opposed to the tangent C to the PPF. So tangent C to PPF, production, tangent C to indifference curve, consumption. Okay. Now recall the point of this model is to illustrate what happens when trade opens up to different factors of production and particularly different aspects of economy and society that can either adjust to changing trade conditions or that cannot adjust to changing trade conditions. Okay, so that's the point of this model. So yeah, let's move on. Now you'll recall that one of the assumptions of this model was that factors exhibit diminishing returns or diminishing marginal productivity. That is to say, factors that are hired relatively early in a production process, or just to stop speaking econ speak, workers that are hired relatively early in a production process tend to be the most productive workers because you hire the best first. And then as production expands, production is forced to utilize less and less efficient factors of production. Okay, and that condition holds true for all industries. So in this case, we just have two. And as a consequence, what we can do is draw this graph, right, that we see here on this slide over here. Okay, and this is a little tricky. So, draw this out, copy it exactly, right, and then you're going to probably get some scratch paper, right, because you're going to want to do this a few times because this is what we're showing here is a lot of stuff, right, and it's more complicated than your average, certainly Econ 103 or 104 graph. What we're showing here is if we start from the lower left-hand corner of this graph, that is the wage rate and production of manufactured goods. Okay. If we start from the lower right-hand corner of this graph, okay, lower right-hand corner, that is production of agricultural goods. So what we've done is we've taken, sort of a second quadrant graph and another second quadrant graph that's sort of flipped and stuck them together. Okay, so you notice that this shape corresponds to that shape over there. All right. Now, the total horizontal distance on this graph is the labor supply. So, for example, if this country where they have more laborers, people move there or they just have more kids, right? Then that graph is the axes themselves are going to do this and shift apart. Okay, so as the sort of real factors of production increase, that's going to happen. All right, now this allows us to show some. So you think like, why do this so complicated? Okay, well, there's a good reason, right? Because we want to show that how with just two things, right? So in this case, ag and manufacturing, right? All labor is utilized in one or the other. So therefore, if we reduce one, we increase the other, and so on. Now, that sort of general equilibrium thinking is really important for an economist to be able to develop. If we think about N industries in a nation, so whatever amount you want to call it, right? If a nation is exhibiting full employment and labor markets are competitive, then we can say things like, well, okay, well, you're going to expand industry X. Well, what industry are you going to contract? Okay, right, absolutely, right. So one gaining implies, right, that there's another one that's shrinking. Okay, and so we can illustrate all that here. The blue line is the price of manufactured goods times the marginal product of labor in manufacturing. The yellow line, which is properly read from the lower right hand side, blue line from the lower left hand side, yellow from the lower right. Okay, the yellow line represents the price of agricultural goods times the marginal product of labor in agriculture. So both of these curves illustrate diminishing returns, even though the yellow line appears to slope upwards. But respective of the lower right hand corner, it is sloping downwards. Both these functions are convex to their respective origin. All right. Okay, so now where those two lines cross is going to give you the wage rate in both industries. It's also going to give you the allocation of labor in both industries. So like how many workers are going to work in ag and how many are going to work in manufacturing. Okay, so the distance the distance on the horizontal axis from 0M to L is the quantity of workers in manufacturing, and the distance from 0 of A is the other, right, agriculture. Okay. And W is the wage rate. And the wage rate has to be the same in both industries for reasons that we discussed in the previous video. All right. Now you might say, okay, why economists with these graphs, and why does it have to be so complicated? Okay, let's take a step back. We're actually explaining something pretty sophisticated here, and this graph is actually a simplification. And it's a simplification to help you. So in other words, I would prefer not to use the graph, right? I prefer to explain all this stuff, either mathematically or with words with you, but wouldn't take. So we're actually explaining something quite complicated here, and we're to build off what I said a moment ago. What we're doing is with this graph is we're demonstrating how adjustments in one industry will impact other industries, right? So this is one thing that here's where the junior grade economists get separated from the serious economists. Is anybody can say, oh well, price of shoes goes up, so like EC 103 style, like price of shoes went up and due to an increase in demand, and then the student says, oh well, that's a movement along the supply curve, and then it drives prices up and quantity up, right? It doesn't take a lot to work that through, but it's a much more significant step to think about how those activities or those occurrences, right, increased demand for shoes or whatever, is going to impact a variety of other markets, including the associated factor markets. That kind of systematic thinking is important for you to get a hold of. And so this is just a shorthand way of showing that kind of stuff. So you should view it as an exercise to kind of build that thinking into your professional processes. Okay, so let's keep moving. Okay, so what we're going to do with using these illustrations here, right, is we're going to assume that the price of one of these goods increases, right, due to some exogenous factor. Could just be, right, like we said, like trade opens, right? So as a result of trade, now suddenly there's global demand for one of these goods as opposed to just local demand, and so prices of that good relative to the other good increase. Okay. So I'm trying to remember what this. Oh, this graph is the volume of trade of goods and services. So this is actually looks like it's a year old now in terms of the data, but global trade is increasing and continues to increase despite um, a lot of the rhetoric in politics as of late. Now, we'll see whether that continues to occur, but I would suggest to you that that is indeed a good thing for everybody for the reasons that we illustrated in the last video with Ricardo. All right. So, as we said that, all right, well, I think we can move on from this slide because we said all that already. Okay, so when prices go up, price of one of these goods go up, what ends up happening to the real wage? Okay, and to understand what happens to the real wage, we need to understand what happens to the marginal product of labor. All right, so here we have median weekly real earnings. So you can see it's actually moves around maybe more than you thought it did. Okay, so here we go back to these graphs. So let's say that the price of manufactured goods increases. So this is completely consistent with this, right? So this is where the price of manufactured goods is increasing relative to ag goods. So we're just following through on that example, but now looking at factor returns, real wages and real wages. So the red function, let's start with the blue function. So the blue function on the left, price of manufactured goods, of course, shifts up now by how much? By whatever the change in manufactured goods is, right? So the further we're altering local prices, the further that's going to shift. Why, again, are prices being altered? They're being altered due to total change in demand resulting from demand from foreigners that didn't exist before, right? Okay. As a consequence, we can see that nominal wages rise from W to W prime, right? Because what happens initially is that that curve shifts up, and wages in one industry rise relative to the other, and then of course what happens is workers start shifting out of ag and into manufacturing to take advantage of those higher wages, bringing the wage back down to point B, where the wages equalize again. Now, a couple things you'll notice about this is, and we'll be continuing this on the following slides, you'll notice that on the horizontal axis on the bottom, what are we illustrating? We're illustrating the reallocation of labor away from ag and to manufacturing, reflecting the higher prices resulting from the higher demand in that market. Okay, so we're illustrating that labor can shift from one place to the other, and so you notice that L prime is significantly to the right of L. Okay. You'll notice also that we have moved down on the manufacturing marginal productivity curve, illustrating what? Well, the workers we picked up in manufacturing were they're less good than the ones we already had. Why? Because if they would have been better manufacturing workers, they would have already been in that industry as opposed to in ag. Okay. And I know now some of you might be saying, well, frictions in geography and stuff like that. And yeah, you're right. You're totally right. I mean, this isn't a perfect analysis. It totally ignores all kinds of labor market frictions and whatnot. Remember, we assumed last time labor markets are perfectly competitive, and we all know that isn't the case. True. So we really have to ask ourselves, with the application of this model, how true is it? Okay, is it mostly true? Are labor markets fairly competitive? If so, then the analysis is relatively good. Or are labor markets totally not competitive? A total mess? Well, then we pretty much need to start from scratch, because all this is going to be wrong. Okay? Right? All right. So assumptions are super important. Super important. The assumptions are the shape of the tool and determine what tool you use. Okay? All right. So super important, right? If you're if you're working a carpentry job and you were going at a nail with a screwdriver, people are going to look at you pretty strange and probably going to get fired. Okay, so that's where those assumptions are. All right. Now you'll notice that we also moved up the marginal productivity curve in agriculture, right? So agriculture is shrinking. So who left? Who stuck around? Well, theory would tell us that the most productive ag workers or the least productive manufacturing workers are the ones who stuck around in ag. Okay, so the remaining productivity in ag actually is going up. Okay. All right. So wait, I think I missed something there. Oh, okay, right. So real wages, right? So we can say that the real wage, right? Because the price of manufactured goods is going up, and the relative price of ag goods is going down. So we can say for sure that the uh, resultant change in wages in terms of manufactured goods is going down. Why? Well, we can see that the change in W, okay, must be, just by geometry, right? The change in W must be less than the vertical shift in that blue and then red function. The difference between P and delta P, or excuse me, P prime. It has to be so, again, just by geometry. So therefore, the wages have not fully compensated for alterations in price in manufactured goods. So these workers are poorer off in terms of manufactured goods, but in terms of ag goods, they're clearly better off. There's no question about it. So whether their net effect is positive or negative depends upon the relative preference for manufactured versus ag goods. All right, let's go on to the next slide, and I'm going to start talking about the intuition of this. I think it'll make a lot of sense for you then. All right, so let's just back up, right? Just back up for a second. Let's tell a story. We had a country called Happy Land that is producing two goods, right? And they're by and large happy. They consume these two goods. They're all cool with it and stuff like that. Then somebody notices from outside Happy Land, call it, I don't know these names. I shouldn't have done this. Now I'm stuck in a corner. Call it, I don't know, other land. Call it Space Land. Sure, why not? Okay. So people from Space Land are like, hey, Happy Land, you got some really cool stuff. We'd like to buy that stuff. And they're like, Happy Land people are like, all right, great. It's going to allow us to sell more. And of course, the price of that thing goes up, right? Because there's Happy Land selling to Space Land or whatever. The price of that thing's going up relative to all other things, which allows wages to rise across both industries. It rises in the first industry because they're selling more, right? The price has gone up. And it rises in the other industry because all other industries, because labor market is competitive and workers can shift back and forth. And so in order to retain their workers, all those other industries need to bring their wage rate up, or they'll leave to go for the higher wage industry. Okay, so what's the story right here? Well, people in Happy Land may not be as happy depending upon what they like. They may find that they really like the same thing that the other Space Land likes, but they can't afford it as much anymore because Space Land, they're buying it all up. If, on the other hand, Happy Land prefers the other item that Space Land does not prefer, or any of the other industries Space Land does not prefer, then they're very happy indeed because they're receiving a bunch of income that they weren't receiving before, which now they can allocate to goods and services that the prices haven't really increased. And so they're clearly better off. Okay, so in class the other day I talked about gentrification, or I attempted to talk about gentrification. Everybody's like, what's gentrification? Okay, so it didn't go very well. But you might look into gentrification, right? And that's sort of the story with gentrification, is you have a neighborhood, maybe people kind of like their neighborhood, but maybe it's a little rough or has some problems. And people with a lot more money say, we really like this neighborhood. We're gonna move in. We're gonna fix up this neighborhood. And they move in. Rent prices go way up, home prices go way up. So people who are homeowners there or whatnot, they've got a lot more wealth now. whether they're happier off, whether the people who lived there initially are happier off, depends really on what they want to consume, right? If they want to continue to live in that new neighborhood where now prices are more expensive, with they're maybe not much better off, right? Because they used to have less money, but they were already living where they wanted to live. But if they're happy moving to some other place, then clearly they're much better off. And maybe their home price has doubled or even tripled as a result of gentrification, and now they can afford to buy a much nicer house in a different, maybe less desirable location. Okay, so they're wealthier, right? They're wealthier. So this is very much what we're seeing in the factor-specific model thus far, right? There's more that this model has to teach us, but that's really the lesson here, okay? And I think you'll see with the little gentrification model I just did, or talk with your friends about this, right? Be like, hey, can we think of other examples of this type of thing occurring? And yeah, this is going to help you learn it, right? Okay, so let's keep moving on, right? Let's keep moving on. Okay, so the result on labor here is unclear. It's unclear whether labor receives a net benefit or a net loss, but it's much more likely that there's a net benefit. Really, the only way you end up with a net loss is if labor only, or pretty close to only, wants to consume the export good in this case, which is manufacturing. And I would encourage you to draw indifference curves that represent those set of preferences. And you're going to see it illustrated in the graphical analysis. Right? So if you draw indifference curves that show extremely strong preference for manufactured goods in this scenario, you're going to see that it's possible for that indifference curve to actually be lower than the pre-trade one. Again, you're going to find it's really unlikely. Like, you really have to have super, super strong preferences for that thing. In the vast majority of cases, they're going to be better off in real terms, right? So they prefer a mix of this and that and the other thing. They're going to be better off, right? They're going to be better off. And there's so many examples of this type of scenario. I really want to jump into them right now, right? This is another example, and this example, and this example. Probably don't want to hear that, but I really encourage you to think about other examples where economic changes bring about these same type of events. Okay, so draw it with different preferences, right? And just see, do I get to a higher indifference curve or not? And you're going to see that it really takes some weird preferences to get to a lower one. So in the vast majority of cases, real wages have increased and labor is better off in a specific factor style situation. Okay, but what about land and capital, right? We've got these two other factors of production we haven't talked about at all. Okay. Okay, right, so land and capital. So here's another port. I forget which port this is. Might be Rotterdam by the look of it. Anyway, whatever. Let's move on. Okay, so how can we figure out? Well, so the equations here represent the returns to both capital and land respectively. So the payment to capital is not dependent at all upon ag goods, right? So it doesn't matter how many ag goods are sold or what prices are at. There's no return to capital. Why? Because capital wasn't used in production, right? Okay. And similarly, you might say, well, didn't the other industry and labor, didn't they do better? Yes, they did, because they can shift back and forth. They're substitutes. Here they're not. Here they can't shift, right? So what goes on with land has no impact on capital, and what goes on with capital has no impact on land because they can't move back and forth, right? So manufactured prices have no impact on land returns, and ag goods have no impact on capital prices. And remember, what are these are just proxies for things that can't move, right? They can't adjust, right? Okay, so we know what's happened to all these variables. How do we know? Well, they're right there. Okay, so you got your P's P here, P here. You got your Q's here, here, right? Okay, so we pop back over here. P of M times Q of M. There's more manufactured goods being made. There's higher prices in manufacturing. Wages are higher, right? But we know that they're less than those other ones. Okay, and the quantity of labor is also increased. But again, we know that that right-hand term is less than the left-hand. Sorry, they're not terms, they're minus signs. We know that P times Q is greater than W times L. Okay, why? Because remember, the price is increased more than the wage payment. Okay, therefore, we know that the payment to capital has increased for sure, right? So the factor that is fixed in the export area is going to gain for sure in a specific factor model, right? So I'm something that's locked into a particular type of production, and now the whole world likes that production. For sure, I'm in good shape, for sure. There's no question about it, right? My market has grown. I can sell to more people. I'm going to make more money. Conversely, in the other market, we know that P and Q, P is the same, right? And Q has fallen, right? W has increased, L has decreased, but there we know that the right-hand two variables are greater than the left-hand two variables for the same reason that we know that the other ones are positive. So we know that in absolute terms, return to land has fallen. Okay, so if you're in a stuck industry, so your resources are stuck in a given industry, and suddenly, your country can start importing that thing from the rest of the world at a lower cost. For sure, you're worse off. For sure you're worse because you can't get out of this declining local industry. You're stuck in it. So for sure you're worse off. So this is the second lesson that the specific factor model tells us. That is that if your assets are dedicated to a specific industry and that industry is able to exploit trade, in other words, to export, you're going to win, okay? And you're going to win big too. And conversely, if your assets are dedicated to an industry that is those goods are going to be imported, right? So you're going to be competing now with the rest of the world. You're going to be worse off, right? And there's no question about it. Okay. So again, if you have specific factors, can those factors be utilized to exploit trade? If so, gain. If not, loss. Okay. So in sum then, well, here's a summary of that. Okay. I like this. Poor cat's locked outside in the rain. I just hope somebody lets him in. In summary, what the specific factor model tells us is that, first of all, that within a society, it's highly likely that there's going to be winners and losers from trade. Okay. It also tells us that areas of the economy that are able to exploit changing prices, that is to say to export, are almost certain to benefit. Factors of production that can move back and forth, that have a lot of flexibility, again, in the first case, right, the first one will benefit, no question about it. In the case of the labor, in this case, the one that can move back and forth, almost certain to be better off as a result of trade. The dedicated assets that can't move and can't exploit export markets, for sure, worse off. Okay, and there you have it, right? And I think it's a pretty reasonable story when one removes it from just all the graphs and technical aspects and so on and so forth, and just thinks about it as a story. But as economists, you need to be able to work through this formally, and you need to know it well enough that you can explain it in those common sense terms. Because of course, common sense is far from common. And with that, I'll leave it there. I'll see you again next time with Heckscher Olden model. Cheers, everybody.